If you are a drafter who's finding themselves hard stuck in gold or platinum or diamond, you have a goal to get to Mythic someday, you're not exactly sure why you're stuck, where you're stuck, I think I might have some answers for you. Welcome everybody. If you're new to the channel, my name's Alex. I play a ton of Limited. I've been Mythic and Limited nearly every month since I started playing Arena in 2020, and more importantly for this video, I spend almost every day coaching people who want to get better in Limited, and I coach people of all skill levels, which means I kind of get to see it all. I get to see what the average gold player or the average platinum player tends to struggle with, the hurdles I think they have to overcome to get to that next rank. So today I figured I would share some of those observations, highlight what you might be missing or what you might lack if you are trying to climb to that higher tier. So let's kick things off where everybody has to start at some point. The low tier is bronze and silver. And I'm grouping those together. I think there's not too much difference between a bronze player and a silver player. I find that when I'm coaching somebody who is in those low tiers and has trouble just getting to gold, just has trouble getting past 2-3 wins in a draft, maybe even like 0-3s most of their drafts, I think the main problem is just a lack of limited fundamentals. Maybe they're a brand new Magic player, maybe they're coming from Constructed with more of a constructed mindset, but I often find that when I look at a deck that somebody shows me that they're like, hey, I just drafted this deck, what do you think of it? Or maybe they drafted a deck that they thought was pretty good and they're like, oh, I 1-3'd. What was wrong with this? It looks pretty good to me. I find that most often they're breaking some sort of cardinal rule of limited Magic. And I've got a deck in front of me here that this is actually a real deck that somebody showed me. And you can see it's got some pretty good cards in it. It's got a Coma World Eater. It's got a Sire of the Seven Deaths, a Spinner of Souls. But you probably also noticed that it's just breaking a lot of fundamental rules of what makes a good limited Magic deck. First and foremost, the mana base. And this is a huge moment for a lot of new players when you tell them, yeah, this isn't a good enough mana base. You can't play a 3-color deck without enough fixing. We're pretty much split down the middle between green cards, blue cards, and black cards here. We're playing close to the devil's mana base of 6/6/6 basics. This deck just isn't going to be functional in so many games, and you're just going to lose to your own deck. Some other fundamentals, having a good curve. This deck's curve is not god-awful or anything, but I would like more 2-drops, maybe a few fewer 5-drops. Another thing that I find players that get stuck in bronze or silver tend to have a problem with is just playing too many cards that don't affect the board. Cards that maybe are some sort of engine card, a build-around enchantment that they haven't supported very well. In this deck, there's a Garruk's Uprising, and to do a quick count, it looks like we've only got like 4, maybe 5 if I'm missing it, 4 power creatures. So, that Uprising, not going to be very good in this deck at all. So yeah, when I say fundamentals, I'm really talking a good mana base, a good curve, making sure you have enough cards that affect the board. If this sounds like you, the number one thing I suggest to solve this problem is just go listen to content, whether it be podcasts, YouTube videos, streams. If you'd like to check out a video of mine that covers all that stuff, I've got a video called The Fundamentals of Limited Deck Building. I'll link that in the description below, but that covers a lot of those, new player traps that people tend to fall into. And even if you're not a new player, say you're an intermediate, or even if you think you are a little more of an advanced player, I would go check out the video. There's a lot of stuff I cover over there. You might not know what you don't know, and I think that's a good place to start. All right, next up is the jump from gold to platinum. And this jump isn't too difficult because as you're going up in gold, you're still going up 2 rungs per win, whereas any higher tier, platinum and diamond and mythic, you're only going up 1 rung per win. So usually I think if you make it out of bronze and silver into gold, the jump to platinum isn't too hard. But the number one thing that I think stops people from going from gold to platinum is just putting bad cards in their deck. Just not knowing what the good cards are, and actually, more importantly, not knowing what the bad cards are. If your deck was full of cards that were like 6 and 7s out of 10, but you didn't have anything that was like a 9 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10, nothing amazing, your deck would still be fairly functional. But I think with even a few cards that are like, F level cards, like 3 out of 10, 2 out of 10 cards, those cards that, a good player is just like, I never really want to put that card in my deck, or it's like a fringe card, it really hurts your win rate to play even 1 or 2 of those cards. So using Foundations as an example, I would say Imprisoned in the Moon. This one's especially tricky because a lot of players look at a card like this and go, oh, it's a removal spell. Great, I can kill anything. Not recognizing the downside of ramping the opponent, which is a really big deal. Or something like Clinquint Sky Mage, damage, which I could see a lot of people looking at it being like, oh, I could see this being a reasonably large flyer, not realizing that a 4-mana 1/1, even though it grows, it's just not an acceptable rate. You can't really put this card in your deck comfortably and expect to win games with it. And especially when you get to rares and mythics, that rarity symbol can kind of trick you. A card like Mossborn Hydra, not a terrible card. You know, I wouldn't classify this as a bad card, but a lot of people take this card way higher than it should go. This is like a C- D+ level card in my books. It's not that great of a card, but a lot of players that are maybe in that gold tier would first pick the Hydra and be like, oh, this is an awesome card. I think given how much information is out there these days with people putting out tier lists, you know, I have a tier list I put out each set. There's 17lands.com will tell you, just how well each card is doing in a set. I'll give you its win rate. There's so many resources out there these days that, number one, if you're not doing that stuff and other people are, well, you're just going to be behind. But two, if you do feel kind of behind, you're like, yeah, I don't feel very confident in my own card evaluation skills, there are a million resources out there. So like I mentioned, I always post my own tier list in the description of, whatever format I'm talking about. You can check that out. But 17lands.com, I always sing the praises of 17lands.com. They just implemented a really nice visual tier list. You can go check that out if you're just not sure how good or not so good certain cards are. I think it's just required reading in 2025 to know before you go into a draft. I'm not necessarily talking your very first draft when you're just learning, but after a week, you get acquainted with the cards. You should roughly know how good or not so good each card is. You really, again, I really want to stress, you really want to just play the good cards, and more importantly, not play the bad cards. It sounds like very, very simple advice, but you'd be surprised how many times a bad card sneaks its way into your deck, and you might not realize it. Another thing I find fairly common with players in gold trying to get to platinum is they might know the good cards, right? Like, they might not have an issue going through the set being like, yeah, that's a good card, that's not a good card. If I quiz them on all the cards in the set, they get a pretty good grade. But they do have trouble figuring out what decks they should play certain cards in. And where this is most relevant, I think, and just broadly most applicable, is you want to make sure that if you're playing an aggressive deck, all of your cards point that direction. And the other way too, right? If you're playing a slower controlling deck, you want to make sure all your cards point in that other direction. So you could have a pretty strong card, but that card might be only really good in a slower deck. You just don't want it in your aggressive deck. The classic example is like a Field Wipe, a Wrath, Day of Judgment. You just don't want this card in your aggressive deck, even though it's a fairly powerful card. Your mid-range decks, your controlling decks, of course. But, I think there's the mindset of like, well, what if I fall behind? A Field Wipe would be pretty nice. When you're playing an aggro deck, you need to be optimistic about how the game's going to go. You have to assume that you're going to be the one on the front foot. You're going to be the one beating down. If this card is the one you draw when you just need one more removal spell, combat trick, it's going to be pretty bad. Atali, Primal Storm, is a pretty good example. This isn't a fantastic card in general, but I'm much more willing to play it in a slower deck rather than a faster deck, right? Like, this is not a 6-drop finisher, I'm going to slam this and just win the game on the spot that the aggro deck might want as this top end card. This card's a little more like, okay, control the board, I play this, it's going to get me some card advantage. Just not really the kind of tool you want for your aggro deck. So I would just really make sure, ask yourself 2 questions when you're deck building, you're drafting. 1, what kind of deck do I have? 2, does the card that I think is pretty good belong in that kind of deck? And most often, this is a case of people playing slow cards in their aggressive decks, but sometimes, you'll see people play, a few too many combat tricks in their slower decks. So I'm like, you don't really want those when your creature count is 13. So really just make sure all your cards are pointing in the same direction, broadly either aggressive leaning or controlling leaning. And then there's the big one, the wall, the place where I think the majority of people trying to make that climb to Mythic for the first time get stuck. Is the place that I think most of the people I coach get stuck in. It's platinum going to diamond. And I can guarantee the number one thing, if you're stuck in platinum going to diamond, your drafts are probably fine. I look at a lot of people's draft logs that, they go like, am I doing something terribly wrong? I just can't get out of platinum 4. And I go, nah, the decks you're drafting are generally pretty good. Maybe I would have taken a few different cards, built it slightly differently. But, generally your decks look pretty functional, pretty good. It's gameplay, though. It's almost always gameplay. So if you find yourself here and just, you've consumed all the content, you're looking at all the tier lists, you're going on 17 lands, you're like, I know the good cards, I know how to build good decks, it's almost always going to be gameplay. And unfortunately, there's no easy fix. Gameplay is one of those things that takes time to get better. If I could just snap my fingers, tell you, just do this, I would do that. I would love to do that. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, but it's really important to know that if you do think your drafting is just pretty good and you're still losing, that's probably where you want to look. So what's the solution here? well, like small plug, you could sign up for coaching, check the link in the description. But, if you're not interested in that and you just want to do it a little more homegrown, you can always talk to friends that are better than you. You can go anywhere on the internet, Reddit, Discord, Twitter, these places where you find a lot of really good players. Ask for a second opinion. Now, getting somebody to go through gameplay with you, that's a big ask. It's not like you just post something on Twitter and be like, hey, go through this game. Maybe that's a little bit difficult. But, Discord communities, they're really, really great. Another small plug, the Limited Level Ups Discord, always a ton of great discussion. If you post your gameplay logs from 17 lands in there and you just say, hey, can somebody take a look and see if I'm doing anything wrong, I can promise you there's gonna be a lot of people just being like, oh yeah, I'd love to take a look. And the community's pretty nice, they're not intimidating, but I really do think if you're stuck here, that's the number one thing you can do. Get somebody who's better than you to look over your games, tell you where you're going wrong. And you know what, even just like a few tweaks, one or two things that are probably big mistakes that you're making, if you just change one or two things, I think you're gonna see improvements in your gameplay pretty quickly. It's a long journey to get really, really good at gameplay, but the first few level ups you have are gonna really, really make a difference. And I think you're gonna get to diamond pretty easily if you're drafting pretty good and then you level up your gameplay a little more. The other thing I would focus on if you're in platinum trying to get to diamond is more nuanced deck building decisions. So aside from just good curve, enough interaction spells, you're going to want to focus on making sure if you're playing a steal and sack deck, what the right ratio of sacrifice outlets and involuntary employment style cards are. You're going to want to know what's the right number of sacrifice fodder cards to make your Ravenous Amulet tick. You're going to want to know how to build more complex mana bases if you've got a multicolor deck, a deck where you're splashing. What's the mana base math behind that kind of stuff? If you're unsure of those kind of numbers, if you're like, just kind of winging it, you're probably losing out some equity there too. The answers to these questions are a bit complicated. They're nuanced, a bit much to describe just in this video. But again, if you feel like you're like, I've got a pretty good handle on deck building, really make sure you're fine tuning. You've got those small details. You know the numbers of things you need in your deck. That's kind of the next step, the next level of deck building in Limited. And then the last one here, the jump from Diamond to Mythic. I think this one's actually the most straightforward. I generally see Diamond players and Mythic players as fairly similar in skill level. I mean, when you're talking like top 100, top 50 Mythic, yeah, that's different. To consistently do that well, you do have to be very, very good, like at the top of your game. But a Diamond player and like a percentage Mythic player or a high hundreds or in the thousands Mythic, I think are roughly equivalent in skill level. The big difference often is time, the number of drafts you can get in, right? I don't remember the numbers exactly, but your win rate to get to Mythic, once you're already in Diamond, it doesn't actually have to be that high. I think given infinite drafts, it's like just above 50% or something like that. Feel free to correct me in the comments if you do know the exact number. I don't have it offhand. But yeah, often it's just like how many drafts can you do a month? That's your limiting factor. Now, of course, the better you are at a given format, the quicker you're going to get to Mythic. You can get there in 7 drafts instead of 15 drafts or something like that. But I've observed that the deficiencies that people have in Diamond, or if they are a Mythic player trying to get to high Mythic, there's not some blanket thing that the majority of players in this ranking have. It's usually pretty person to person. If you're consistently getting to Diamond, you're probably a pretty good player. Of course, that doesn't mean that you don't have somewhere to get better. There's always going to be, every Magic player in the world, guarantee, even the best one, there's something they can do better. But unlike the Platinum player, who I say, there's probably big holes in your gameplay, there's often not going to be like this gigantic blind spot. The level ups you have at this point, they're probably going to be incremental. Your blind spots are probably pretty small. They're small edges, right? But that's what really matters when you get to this level, right? When you're playing against really good players, it's all about those small edges. Anyways, hope you enjoyed this video. Hope this gave you a little bit of insight. If you did like it, consider a subscribe, a like, a comment, all that good stuff, and we'll see you next time.